Okay, everyone, this is the peopling of Texas. This is going to be part one of the peopling of Texas because I want to put Texas and Native Americans in Texas the broader context of Mesoamerica, not just Texas, not just one little part of what we're doing here, but just the broader context of Mesoamerica. The people that we're going to be talking about and the people who make up uh, the Native Americans of present day Mexico and South America, they're all going to come through Texas. Texas is going to be a sort of clearinghouse, an important meeting place for all of these groups. So it's important that we start with all of this sort of stuff. We're going to talk about Paleo Indians, we're going to talk about Archaic Indians, all of these different types of groups. So, when it comes to Texas, there are four natural regions to discuss about this particular state, the four natural regions that people are going to be coming through to come through Texas and to all of these other areas. These four natural states are represented on the screen, on the map that you see on the screen. The first natural region is the coastal region. This is the area around the Gulf Coast, but it has groups like the Karankawa, the Tonkawa, the Bidai, the uh, uh, Coahuiltecans, Carrizos, all sorts of different groups within that Gulf Coast region. Okay. Um, the second natural region is what we're going to call the Northern Central Plains region. And I'm going to move my cursor here a little bit. The Northern Central Plains region is the area that is North Texas, Dallas, Fort Worth, Waco, those areas today, areas that are close to Oklahoma. And you can see again, there are various groups that are part of this area. The Wichita, the Comanche, to an extent, although the Comanche are probably more Great Plains than North Central Plains, but the Comanche are there. Um, you're going to have a whole bunch of different groups throughout that area. Our third area in the natural regions is the Great Plains area, the Great Plains region, which stretches from the Panhandle area of Texas all the way down to the Rio Grande. It's kind of right in the center of Texas. And it goes literally straight down in Texas. If we were to take it upward further from here, from what you see on this map, the Great Plains literally stretches pretty much from in the middle of what is today the United States. And then lastly, we've got the mountains and basin region, which is more or less West Texas, the area that extends from West Texas into present day El Paso. It actually extends out into present day New Mexico. Texas was, and I think is still, we would consider it a vast area. And as you can see with the map on the screen here, there were a lot of different people who came to occupy this region before anybody from Europe ever even began to think about Texas or the Americas or anything like that. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about is the different groups of people who are coming through here. And we're going to try to identify them in some very general terms and narrow it down into specifics. So the first group we're going to be dealing with is what are called Paleo Indians. These are the people that we're going to be dealing with who date approximately to 12,000 years ago, 12,000 before the Common Era. These are the people who arrived by walking for generations, generation after generation, crossing what is today known as the Bering Straits. But at that moment, as we're going to see in a little bit, at that moment it was called the Bering Land Bridge. So we'll talk about that more in detail, but I just want to give you the basics here. It's called the Bering Land Bridge. That's how they're going to cross. It's going to connect Alaska with Northeast Asia. There's some data that contradicts this to the point that when we get into it in more depth, I'm going to say this again. that 5 years from now, if I'm teaching this class, some of the data I'm giving you may not actually be good data. It may actually be out of date. But for right now, consensus is that this group of people, these Paleo Indians, were people who walked across that Bering Land Bridge and then migrated downward. They started walking across the Rocky Mountains and downward and dispersing throughout the Americas. Um, this land bridge allowed Paleo Indians to populate the entirety of two continents. And when it comes to Texas, they left evidence of their existence in places like Abilene, Texas, Midland, Texas, Plainview, Texas. So we know that they were here. And these Paleo Indians are the first groups of people that are in the Americas, and they're going to lay the groundwork for later groups that are called the Archaic Indians. These are people who are going to follow along and move beyond present day Texas. They're going to come through in generation after generation. They're going to be coming through in waves, and they're going to hit certain areas. They're going to disperse outward. In some cases, they'll disperse downward, but every single time they disperse downward, there's also an outward dispersal. Okay. These archaic Indians, the difference between archaic and Paleo Indians, the big difference is that the archaic Indians laid roots. They laid down roots in places like Texas, unlike the Paleo Indians, who were, for the most part, nomadic peoples. The archaic Indians are the people who are considered the direct ancestors to indigenous peoples, or the people that we call indigenous peoples. Now, they're not exactly the same groups of people. They've got different backgrounds. I want to emphasize this, but they're not that different. Okay, they're not so far different from one another that we can't talk about them as groups together. Okay. Now, I also want us to think about some things about archaic Indians and Paleo Indians and some terminology. Now, the term that I typically use is Native Americans. That's my kind of go-to term. The second term that most historians use is Indians. Now, I use Indians and Native Americans and these other terms to an extent as a way of avoiding repetition, because obviously too much repetition is going to wind up sounding boring. It's going to wind up getting old after a certain point. The lectures may start getting exhaustive to an extent, but what I don't want them to become is exhausting. And if you use the same terminology over and over again when you're talking about the same group of people, it becomes exhausting. Okay, so sometimes I may say indigenous peoples. I may say Amerindians. There's no consensus today about what the quote proper terminology is. I think that by now in 2025, we can agree that there are some terms that are out of bounds, like the name of the former name, excuse me, of the now Washington Commanders. That's a term that is outdated, offensive, and we shouldn't be using it. But terminology like Indian, Amerindian, Native Americans, indigenous peoples, these are all acceptable terms. Some people don't like all of these terms. Some people prefer that they not be used. And I will also be perfectly upfront with you. If one of these terms bothers you for some reason, if you don't like a particular term, then please let me know. Let me know that you don't like that term, and I will do my best to try to kind of wipe it from what we're actually doing. But right now, the terms that you see on the screen here are the ones that are prevalent throughout the literature, throughout the textbooks, the textbook you have, throughout the things that you're going to be reading this semester and doing your research project. Those terms are the ones that are prevalent throughout all of that literature. Right. Now, I also want us to understand that when it comes to these Native American groups, that these indigenous peoples are different from one another. And I think a lot of times we forget in the United States, we think a lot about ethnicities and similarities of different groups of people, but we kind of, in emphasizing these things, in emphasizing ethnicity and trying to find common ground, we also kind of de-emphasize that these groups are different. We don't look at Native Americans in a lot of cases. We don't look at them and think of the tremendous amount of diversity amongst Native American groups. It's all just a matter of all Indians or all Native Americans. And it's kind of hard to get people beyond that mindset. Okay, so we're going to try not to do that. These groups of people in the archaic world, in the paleo world, these people are exceptionally diverse. They're very different from one another. They do not all speak the same languages. They don't all have the same culture. They don't all have the same cultural beliefs. And just too many of us think that it's basically there's this group of Native Americans, they are representative of all, and they all do this sort of things. Think about what the images we have about Native Americans from Hollywood. They're almost always Native Americans who are hunters on horseback and all of that stuff. So we're going to try to remember that these people have different cultures, different customs, different religions, different ideas of family, what family actually means, how a person becomes part of a family. They have different governments. They have different governmental structures. So what I want you to think about, again, as you listen to this lecture and as you do your readings, I want you to think about difference and diversity. These people are sometimes at peace with one another. Sometimes they're at war with one another. And to be very clear about this, Native Americans were also territorial from one another. This really shouldn't surprise you to find out that they were territorial. But again, for a lot of people in the United States, it surprises them to find out that Native Americans were territorial. Okay. Now, part of the, I guess, kind of a visualization, if you will, is if you were to imagine yourself, now obviously you can't do this, but if you were to visualize yourself standing on the globe and walking from, say, Texas to Europe, would you think that walking from Texas to Europe, you're going to find one culture, one set of religious traditions, one set of political entities, or anything like that? And the answer is, of course not. If we were to think about this, we were to take it another way and say, walk, quote unquote, from Texas to West Africa. Once you got to West Africa, in West Africa alone, you'd find 700 separate, autonomous, cultural, political, racial, ethnic entities within West Africa. So again, just thinking about Native American cultures, we're not going to find one group. We're not going to find that they are, quote, all the same. Lastly, here, before I kind of move on to specifics, these people are all also parts of various nations. Sometimes when we refer to indigenous peoples, we use the word tribe and tribal. And in some cases, it's actually correct. It's not wrong. But the term tribe in and of itself tends to refer to something that's small, it's clannish, it's locally oriented. And what I want us to know, and what I want us to keep in mind again, is that especially in the years before European arrival, Native Americans existed in groups that were actually nations. They occupied huge regions of space. They occupied large parts of Texas. Okay? They functioned as full-fledged societies, independent societies. They had rules. They had jails. They had recreation. They had parks. They had wedding ceremonies. They were as fully functioning of a society or group of societies as we are in the modern world. Now, if you think back to the first slide that I showed you a couple of minutes ago, where I showed you the map of Texas and I told you that there were all of those different groups occupying Texas, the peoples that are going to populate this region are sometimes going to be at war with one another. They're sometimes going to be at peace with one another. But the word, again, is diversity. Okay? The people are diverse because Texas is diverse, because of those natural regions. Okay? It creates a diversity of cultures because of the diversity of resources, because of the diversity of physical locales. Okay, extensive and sophisticated Native American populations are going to be passing through Texas and coming and going out of Texas and staying in Texas. Okay, they're going to be important groups of people here. Hopefully, by the end of this lecture, and certainly by the end of the semester, what we're going to see is that Paleo Indians were important in terms of the diffusion of cultures across the state, what becomes Texas, and across what becomes the Western Hemisphere. Now, among the groups that are important right off the bat when it comes to Paleo Indians, okay, and what we're going to call the Texas Gateway, among the two big groups here are groups called the Pueblo Indians and the Mississippians. Okay, the Pueblos were Native American peoples that occupied parts of West Texas, present-day New Mexico, and those surrounding areas. They were people who built massive structures that were called pueblos. These are the thing I'm circling here with the cursor on the screen. Those structures that are built right into the mountains are called pueblos, hence the term Pueblo peoples. Okay, these people they lived in these regions, but they didn't necessarily, in these pueblos, excuse me, but they didn't always necessarily stick around in those pueblos. There were dwellings built into the sides of caves that were meant to be able to be abandoned quickly and get out quickly if they had to. Now, ultimately, to be fair and to be clear about this, Pueblo Indians are going to give way to peoples who are much more sedentary, people who are going to actually be sticking around and setting roots. And Pueblos the structures that they build are going to be like the Pueblos, and they will be permanent structures. But the big thing, remember, in the Paleo era, is that these peoples are on the move. They are nomadic. Okay. Now, the next group of people are the Mississippians, or as they're frequently referred to, they're referred to as mound builder societies. Now, the mound builder societies, again, they're going to stretch across both eras. They're going to stretch across the Paleo and the Archaic eras. Okay, and they're going to build in these Mississippian or mound builder societies. They are going to build a ton of what are called mounds. These mounds will serve as living structures. They will be burial structures. They'll be religious sites, all sorts of things. Now, the most prominent of the mound builder societies is pictured here on the screen, and I'm going to try to circle it here with the pointer. This picture here comes from a place called Cahokia. Okay, that's the most prominent of the mound builder societies. It exists in what is today present-day St. Louis. They're frequently referred to as Mississippians as opposed to mound builders because of their proximity to the Mississippi River. Now, because of their proximity, because they're close to the Mississippi River, they're really important when it comes to trade throughout the entire Western Hemisphere. They're a massive trading group. The massive pyramid that you see in the center of this, or in this picture, is representative of the center of their society. And there's a very famous painting, and I think I've actually got it up. I've got it in our second lecture. I've got it up as an example of this stuff. But it shows the massive pyramid and its relation to a sort of horseshoe shaped village, as well as the proximity to the Mississippi River, along with a whole bunch of etched roads that are in the painting going into and coming out of Cahokia, demonstrating just how important Cahokia was to the trade networks that were in the Americas. One of the other things that demonstrates the importance here is that historians and anthropologists have found in excavating various Native American sites is that there are amongst Northeastern American Indian groups like the Iroquois Nation, they have goods that were transported from Mayan culture and from Aztec culture Okay, and we see in places like South America, we see Native Americans in South America having Iroquois goods or having goods that originated with people in present day Vancouver, Canada. So we know that there was trade going on all through the continents of South America and North America, and Cahokia is a huge part of that. And for what it's worth, if you take my Mexican American history class at some point, this is not Mexican American history, but if you do take that class, we're going to talk about the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan, which is another big part of this transcontinental trade that's happening way before anybody's showing up from Europe. All right. Now, despite all of the talk about diversity that I told you about just a few minutes ago, uh, I also want to spend a couple of minutes about talking about the commonalities that all of these groups had. We can have all of these different diverse groups and have different ideas and different cultural traditions. But since they are emanating from a common starting ground or from a common starting point, there are necessarily going to wind up with some commonalities, some things that link these groups. Okay, so we're going to talk about these, but remember, I want you to be thinking in terms of we're making generalizations here. Okay, so broader stuff. And over the course of the semester, when we talk about these peoples, we're going to go from the general to the more specific. Okay, so here we're talking about generalities. All right, so again, they're not monolithic. They are not all doing the same thing. They're not all moving in the same direction, but there are commonalities. All right. Now, first, the population, in terms of commonality, the populations of Native Americans, especially the ones in Texas, can best be described as dispersed and dispersed widely, and not necessarily evenly. It's not like there's a pocket here and a pocket here and a pocket here and a pocket here and a pocket here. They didn't all necessarily congregate together. They just kind of had, in some cases, they had a common center and just went outward in all different directions. Now, for example, you've got groups like the Cottons, and we've got the Comanches and the Karankawa, and they don't all gravitate to one central location. If necessary, they did. The Comanches were a really great example of this. During times of war, for example, they would all kind of gather for a common war council. But after the war council was over, or after a summer hunt, they would then again disperse out into their own individual settlements. Okay. Now, these different groups of Native Americans occupy almost every corner of Texas as we know it today. And they all knew of one another. They engaged one another. But there is certainly a vastness to Texas that doesn't exist elsewhere. And it accounts for this massive dispersal of population across what becomes the state of Texas eventually. Secondly, governments amongst these Native American groups, while they're not all the same, they do have some general similar characteristics. Most Native American groups, not all, but most, the overwhelming majority, operated under a system where there was not a single central authority. There's no head of state like we would have in modern politics today. Now, I'm sure you've all heard the phrase or the terminology of chiefs and chieftains, but very few Native American groups had chiefs that dictated or ruled in the sense that Europeans thought of rulership. In most of the places that Europeans came into contact with Native Americans, and in virtually all of the places in Texas, rule was done through administrative councils and through consensus. Now, what I mean by that, just to make sure we're clear on this, there is not one person who is, quote, the chief, and the chief says, this is how it is, and we're doing it my way or else. Okay, that's not how it works. Okay, it's done through an administrative council, and the chief, quote unquote, the leader, may be the leader of the administrative council, but they don't have the power to just say, we're doing it and this is how it's going to be. Okay. Now, overwhelmingly, again, when we think in terms of the general, overwhelmingly, this leadership is male oriented. Now, there are certainly, again, some exceptions where women are involved in the government, but most of the groups that we'll be seeing and that you would read about in your textbook are patriarchal, especially among those in the western parts of Texas. It's almost exclusively patriarchal societies. And the nations are run, quote unquote, by men. They are the leaders of society, they are the heads of households. These governmental executives, the people who hunt, the people who do the bulk of farming, the people who control trade and commerce, these are the men within these Native American societies. Again, there are societies that are matriarchal. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. They exist, but they are, by definition, exceptional. They are the exception. They are not the norm. Okay? Now, Native Americans, as I think I mentioned here, tended to be territorial in nature. They did not, to be clear about this, they did not have a concept of individual land ownership. Rather, they lived on land that, as they saw it, had been bestowed upon them by their God. And their ownership, if they were to ever use that word ownership, their ownership was temporal in nature, meaning it's limited by time, as in you have a time that you are on this earth. Once your time on earth is over, your ownership ceases to exist. It doesn't pass down to another generation. Now, pass down to a group? Sure. The Cottons believed that their generation gave way to the next generation of Cottons. Okay, but it wasn't. I just want to make sure that we're clear about this. They don't have an understanding of individual private land ownership like we do today. They believed that there is Karankawa land or Kiowa land or Comanche land, but not that guy's land is over there. Okay, now they're sedentary as well, meaning they settle down, they plant. Now, again, except for groups like Comanche and Kiowa, a lot of groups on the Great Plains. But these people, by and large, are going to plant because of cultivation and the land they're cultivating. They, again, develop an ownership of, or excuse me, a concept of communal ownership of land, but not individual. They may also, because they're territorial about this stuff, because they're thinking in terms of this is Karankawa land or this is Comanche land. They also are frequently going to go to war with one another and then later with Europeans to protect, to maintain, and yes, sometimes expand the areas that they collectively own. Now, when it comes to religion, these Native American groups, generally speaking, are polytheistic, meaning multiple gods, multiple spirits. They had gods and spirits of war, of sun, of light, of love. These are all among the types of the deities and spirits amongst all of these different Native American groups. Now, some, some again did have a monotheistic view about this stuff. The exceptions, okay, the bulk of these peoples had polytheistic views, but some small groups were exceptions. They were exceptions in that they had one God. Now, I mention this because those groups that were, in fact, monotheistic, those groups, they had it a little bit easier in terms of assimilating within Spanish societies when conquistadors came over and the Spanish administrators came over and started demanding loyalty and started demanding conversion to Christianity. Those that had monotheistic cultures tended to assimilate easier than those that were polytheistic. But again, it's just a tendency. It's not a quote, hard and fast rule, if you will. Now, in terms of their ideas about nature and religion are very much connected in this stuff. Many Native American groups typically espoused a reverence for nature. They were fearful of nature. They were grateful about nature. They believed that their God could be vengeful if they strayed too far from what their faith actually was. They looked at things like tornadoes and hurricanes, bug infestations. These are things that happened during that era too. When they happen, there's an understanding amongst these different groups of people that it's not just a natural occurrence, that if we are destructive, if the people are destructive, then nature fights back. It's something that they had brought on themselves. That's how they saw it. If you want to utilize resources, their thought went, that's fine. You can utilize resources, but you do it with reverence for the land. You do it with respect for the land and respect for the resources. So, for example, hunters revered the animals that they hunted. You don't overplant. You don't squander and overhunt. You don't waste things. If you waste, if you are wasteful, then nature fights back. Okay? These Native American groups also had a reverence for shamans and spiritual healers. These spiritual healers could be male or female. The shamans and spiritual leaders were often said to have curative abilities. They had the ability to read omens, the ability to remove evil spirits. They were also, in some cases, said to have powers of a supernatural origin. Now, I want to make clear that, or make plain something, that when I say a lot of these things, when I say stuff that says this one, that they had powers of a supernatural origin, don't take this to mean that people believed that they had shamans running around who could go, I'm turning that person into a frog or something like that. Much of what we know about a lot of the not the Paleo Indians, but the uh, later groups that are part of uh, Texas Indians, a lot of those groups, what we know, come from a group of people that are called Hispaniolas, people who were from Spain, who settled in Texas and present day Mexico and all of these other areas, and wound up coming into contact with these Indians and writing about them through a lens generated by their European cultures. So when they talk about them having mystic powers or supernatural powers, understand that people in this era, in this area, people who were Karankawas, for example, believed that their shamans had the power to remove evil spirits if it was done in accordance with a proper way of doing things. But the shaman couldn't just be disrespectful of nature and just in and of their own power go, I'm fixing this. Okay, they couldn't do that. Okay. Now, I also want to mention that a big part of why they were thought to have supernatural powers came from the use, in some cases, of hallucinogens, things like cocoa leaves, because they're numbing. Okay, and they used a lot of these things like cocoa leaves to cure things ranging from headaches to internal injuries. They were very well versed in what these could do to the body and how they might actually ease pain or eliminate pain. Now, these shamans and spiritual leaders like this, the spiritual healers, they are not necessarily priests. In some cases, there might be some crossover, but there's not always crossover. I don't want to give the wrong impression here. Frequently, they are a parallel group to the religious leaders. So if you want to think about religious leaders in the same sense of Western religions, like you've got a minister or a priest, and they are, quote, the religious leaders. And then in various churches, you've got what are called lay leaders. Okay. The spiritual leaders and the shamans within these Native American groups are on a par, kind of, with the lay leaders. There are the religious leaders who have influence over one area of people's spiritual lives, and the shamans and spiritual healers have control over another part of their spiritual lives. Okay, there is a priestly class. The shamans and spiritual leaders are not a part of that, but they're a parallel to them, as opposed to an intersection of the two types of powers. Okay, they're parallel to one another in terms of power and influence. Now, the last common characteristic I want to deal with all of these different groups is the family. Okay? Native Americans, for the most part, lived and operated under what we refer to today as the nuclear family structure. Husbands, wives, spouses, plus their children. They had extended families that were close to them, and if not together with them. So grandparents were frequently in the same household. Aunts and uncles could also live often under the same roof. So you would have nuclear family units, but often in these uh, big, massive home structures. These people fell in love and married each other in the same way that we are, in the same sense of the way that we do. Uh, I'm not going to tell you that they were all going out on dates and doing stuff like that. So I kind of have to be careful in my own terminology here. But they fell in love and married each other just like we do today in the modern world. For the most part, these marriages were monogamous marriages. Again, some exceptions and outliers exist, but again, they're just that. They're exceptional. Divorces were not unheard of during this era. They occurred they occurred throughout these groups, and they occurred in a prescribed process. So it's not like these people had no understanding of divorces or a path to it. They understood that sometimes there was a need to get rid of a marriage. They thought there was a need for the divorce, and they had a way to govern how the divorce actually happened. Men and women did, to again be clear, men and women did tend to operate under what we today refer to as separate spheres. There were certain tasks or roles that were considered, quote, men's work, and then there are other tasks that are considered to be women's work. And there was very little intersection among the two sets of tasks. They operated separately more often than not. Where they intersected, however, though, there is a couple of places. They intersected at the home, but outside the home, there was a far more clear gendered division of labor. The men did the hunting, the fishing, they did construction, they made war against their enemies, they engaged in politics, they controlled trade, while women were in charge of virtually everything that had to do with the domestic sphere. Now, this division of labor, if we want to call it that, the gendered division of labor, is passed on to their children at a very early age. Child rearing was what we would today refer to as co-parenting, meaning that both parents did take responsibility for their children and how their children were raised. However, men were absolutely responsible for teaching young boys how to become, quote, men in those societies. And women typically took responsibility for raising the girls to be women within that society. All right. Now, let's get to a timeline here so we can talk about these different groups of people and where they slot in so that we can kind of have a better understanding of where we're going to be when we start actually talking about Texas. Okay. So Paleo Indians are what many people think of, or on some level, are what many people think of when they think of Native Americans. They're hunters and gatherers. They were nomadic, meaning they moved place to place. They didn't just stay in one spot. And just to kind of recover some ground here, these are the people who crossed the Bering Straits during the last ice age in search of large game to hunt. These are the people who arrive in, quote, the New World, even though there's no such thing as a New World at this point. But they're the ones who crossed the Bering Straits during the last ice age. It's a very broad time frame that we have for the, quote, Paleo Indians, but they start arriving in what will later be termed the New World sometime between 40,000 and 8,000 years before the Common Era. Okay? The next group, excuse me, is the Archaic Indians. The Archaic Indians are the first Indians who begin to engage in agriculture. These are the ones who are domesticating maize, corn, all sorts of other products like later on beans, tomatoes, cocoa, potatoes. Pick something, they're domesticating the crop. They're starting at around 5,000 in the Common Era. Okay. The next group that we're talking about, the next group is the formative or pre-classic Native Americans. And just so we were clear on this as well, these are not my names for these groups of people. Okay, historians who were around long before I was around are coming up with well, these are the Paleo Indians, these are the Archaic Indians, these are the formative or pre-classic, and we're just continuing to use those names. All right, so formative or pre-classic Native Americans, these are the people who are becoming even more sedentary as they settle through the so-called New World. As they move further south, they become more sedentary. Now, what marks them as different from, say, the Archaic Indians is that they too are engaged in agricultural production, but it's much more intense agricultural production. And because of the intensity of that agricultural production, these formative or pre-classic Indians are reliant on the production of agriculture. Previous groups are reliant on hunting and gathering. Paleo Indians, absolutely, hunting and gathering. No agriculture whatsoever. Archaic Indians, still reliant on hunting and gathering, but they are domesticating some crops. Formative or pre-classic Indians are now at a point where they're saying, no, we rely on agricultural production for our basic staple crops, the things that literally feed us day to day. Okay, so they are reliant on this agriculture. They're starting to evolve from chieftains and more locally oriented types of government to complex government forms. They're the ones that are going to be spreading out religious traditions that focus on earth and fertility, because again, reliance on crops means a reliance on a fertile earth. Okay, so to give you an idea of who these people might be, the Mayans are going to appear during this formative or pre-classic era, somewhere between the years 2000 before the Common Era and the year 200 of the Common Era. So they kind of cross that dividing line where you've got the, before the Common Era, then basically year zero, and then the Common Era. Okay, we see among these formative or pre-classic groups, we see population growth, the development of market economies, and we see the development of solar calendars and organizational evolution that I talked about just a couple of minutes ago. So all of these things are part of the formative or pre-classic era. Then we have what are called the, quote, classic societies. The classic societies begin appearing between the years 200 and 900 of the Common Era. And just again, so we're clear, we are in the Common Era. Those of us, we are all alive. We're all watching these videos, or in this case, delivering these videos. In 2025, we're in 2025 of the Common Era. Okay, so these people are, a few hundred years before us. Okay, this period is also often referred to as, quote, the golden age of Mesoamerica. What we see in this golden age or classic period is nation-state development. We see kings and priests becoming much more important within societies. Plus, we see a ton of technological innovation that goes along with this. Like, for example, the development of irrigation systems. We see population growth exploding during the classic era. We see advances in things like the arts. We see excellence within ceramics, monumental architecture, the development of pyramids and large temples. We're also going to see the first big, and when I say big, I mean enormous, city in the Western Hemisphere, a city called Teotihuacan, which is going to have 150,000 residents, which at this particular moment, okay, the years 200 through 900 of the Common Era, Teotihuacan is the largest city in the world outside of China. It's far bigger than anything that exists in Europe during this similar period, 200 to 900 of the classic era. So we've got that. And then we've got the so-called post-classic era, which is from the year 900 in the Common Era to about 1519 of the Common Era. This is when the emergence of the real city-states and empires within Mesoamerica begins. Not just kingdoms, but empires like the Aztec Empire. We start to see civil developments within these groups. We see marketplace innovations. We see commercial elements becoming the dominant part of society. Now, when you've got that commercial element, again, it's reliant on agricultural production, but people are becoming involved in commerce as the way to make their living. They don't always make their living as a farmer or a hunter-gatherer or a shepherd or something like that. They're making their living in commerce. Okay, so trade is becoming increasingly important with this. We also see the implementation of metal within weaponry, and as trade increases during this era, we're also going to see increased warfare amongst these groups, not just with one another, because when we're talking about 1519 is when we're talking about the conquest of the Aztecs. So it's also going to involve Europeans here as well. Now, Mesoamerica is one of the 6 so-called cradles of civilization. Now, I'm not going to ask you this on a test. I'm not going to say, well, what are the 6 cradles of civilization? Mesoamerica literally means middle America. Okay, so if we were to take the continents of North and South America, right? So we've got them up here on the screen in this little inset. Let me switch to laser pointer mode. In this little inset here on the map, we've got North and South America. Right in the middle of it is Meso or Middle America. Okay. Now, as I mentioned, I'm not going to ask you this on an exam or anything like that, but for trivia's sake, the 6 cradles of civilization are China, the Indus Valley, Mesopotamia, the Nile Valley in present-day Egypt, the Andes in South America, and Mesoamerica. These are the 6 cradles of civilization. And again, as we've got people coming into Mesoamerica, as they migrate from here across that Bering Land Bridge all the way down through North America and into, quote, Mesoamerica, they're going to be coming right through Texas to do it. Okay, so how do they get here? I've asked this question at least twice already in this lecture. So we're going to finally get to it. How do they get here? The biggest, I guess the most popular theory, I shouldn't say the biggest theory, they came across the Bering Straits, or where the Bering Straits are today. Okay, and as you can see, if you look at this map that's on the screen, you can see just how enormous this area actually was or at one point. Okay, you can see that it's all iced over during that last ice age. It's covered in ice, this huge landmass that they've got called alpine glaciation on this map is a series of just literally solid ice that stretches from the northernmost border of what is the United States today, all the way through Canada, all the way up to Alaska. And then you've got this area here that is kind of a subcontinent called Beringia. And then right over here, where my cursor is pointing now, is Northeast Asia. Okay? It's the so-called Bering Land Bridge that people are going to walk across. It connects North America into Asia. Now, obviously, the alpine glaciation does not exist today. What's left are glaciers up here in the Arctic Circle. That's what's left of all of this. Okay, but during this particular era, it, along with the landmass that's later going to be submerged, forms a subcontinent called Beringia that allows these people to literally just walk across this area and literally walk into North America. Okay, now they track back to approximately 7,000 years before the Common Era. Okay, so we're in 2025, so it's roughly 42,000 years ago. Okay, now the argument goes these are migratory people, they are migrating. Okay, they're following large game. Okay, they're hunters and gatherers that are following large game, and they would catch up with the large game. But as the ice age is ending, this alpine glaciation starts to melt. And when it does melt, it fills in Beringia. Okay, Beringia becomes submerged under what is today the Bering Sea and the Bering Straits. Okay, so they are stuck, for lack of a better way to put it. They're stuck in what becomes North America. Now, there's also some evidence to suggest, not a ton of evidence, but some evidence that suggests that in addition to people who were migrating following large game, that there were also some people who were escaping war as well. They were escaping wars with different groups of people in Northeast Asia. And what we know about these groups, we know courtesy of obviously remains and things that like carbon dating. And the remains of what we find from carbon dating suggests that it's not just 40,000 before Common Era. We are some historians and anthropologists argue that carbon dating shows human beings or human-like people, hominids, in what is today North America as far back as 110,000 years before the Common Era. So there's a lot of data out there. It has not reached a consensus point. There are a lot of historians and mostly anthropologists, not so much historians, but mostly anthropologists who are poking holes in the theories that these people are arguing about. So there's evidence to suggest it, but it's not accepted by everyone. At some point, though, who knows? It might be accepted by everyone. So again, 5 years down the road, this whole stuff that I'm talking to you about continental and alpine glaciation, and this is when it starts, that may be out of date 5 years from now. Especially since we've got the polar ice caps melting, it means we're going to start discovering more and more and more stuff. But we're not there yet. Okay, so for right now, what I've just told you, this is the consensus. This is what historians would say, this is what happened. Okay, now, again, they're nomads. They're not sedentary farmers. These people who are doing this arrive at least maybe 40,000 years before the Common Era, but at the latest 20,000 before the Common Era. They do not start farming, as I mentioned, until 7,000 to 5,000 BCE, okay, before the Common Era. As farmers, they are doing something new. They are altering what's going on, okay? And as they are altering what's going on, they themselves are altered. Okay. Now, as far as altering what's happening, they're attempting to control their environment, particularly in what is today the Valley of Mexico. As the ice age is ending, water sources are drying up, flora is disappearing, wild game is disappearing. So people in these areas were essentially forced to farm. Okay, especially when they found that their populations are starting to grow, they're starting to realize it is quite literally farm or perish. Okay, farm or die. Now, as it turns out, the first crop that is going to be grown by these people is going to be maize or corn. Corn is by far the most bountiful crop that these people are going to grow. It's first domesticated around 9,000 BCE, and it is what made large societies possible. Corn was what we call omnipresent. It was everywhere. It was so omnipresent that it became sort of a unifying factor amongst these Mesoamerican people. These people, particularly in the Archaic era, wind up being called by historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists, wind up being called, quote, the corn people, because corn spreads across a gigantic area. Now, if you want to know how big an area it extends, just look at this map on the screen. The red is how corn disperses throughout North America, North and ultimately Central America. Okay? It extends across what is basically the land where that makes up I-10 today. It expands all the way across the continental part of the present day United States and literally northward, northeastward, northwestward into the modern Midwest. It spreads everywhere until the point that corn is the staple crop found by conquistadors when they start coming in to what is today Mexico. It is found by the English settlers who land at Jamestown. It's found by the English people who land in Plymouth and Massachusetts Bay. It is everywhere. But in Mesoamerica, there's something different about all of this. Okay, there's something different if we kind of think about Mesoamerica versus Jamestown. In places like Jamestown, it's the dietary staple. Okay, meaning these English people, when they get to Jamestown or when they get to Plymouth, if you want to think of it that way, when they get there, they accept we either eat corn or we are going to die. Okay, that's what I mean by dietary staple. These people didn't have corn in England, so the idea of picking up corn and going, yes, this is food, didn't make sense to them. But they realized very quickly, we either eat this or we die. Okay, so that's what I mean by a dietary staple. In Mesoamerica, though, it's not a dietary staple. It plays a central role in everything. It plays a central role in ritual. It plays a central role in ceremonies, in addition to being their staple food crop. The growth of corn, for example, leads to a ton of cultural change. Around 3000 before Common Era, Mesoamerican peoples were growing so much corn that they had large agricultural surpluses. Now, because they've got these agricultural surpluses, with a steady food supply, they start seeing population growth as a consequence of it. So surplus food equals population growth. Now, if we contrast that with what's going on in Europe during this era, there's not a lot of population growth because Europeans do not have a staple crop like maize to feed or create or sustain a growing population. And before any of you start thinking, well, what about potatoes in Ireland or potatoes in Russia or someplace like that? That doesn't happen until after Christopher Columbus lands in the New World and there's an exchange of these goods across the Atlantic because they didn't have potatoes either. Potatoes originated here in the Americas. So everything springs from the growth of corn. Okay, we've got surpluses, we've got population growth, we've got the development of labor specialization, which means we're going to start seeing specialized tool usage and creation. We're going to see a lot more pottery being made in Mesoamerica. We could actually go much, much deeper into all of this. But I also want to point out that if we started going deeper and deeper into this, it probably would not fit too well with Texas history. If you were to take Mexican American history with me, yes, absolutely, because we'd be talking about cultures like the Olmec or the mother culture. We'd be talking about the Mayans, the Aztec, the Toltec, and all of these other different groups, but they don't make sense for a Texas history class. So we're going to rein this in. I'm going to stop it here. And in the next lecture, what we're going to do is we're going to break down the peopling of Texas in a much more precise way. So that'll be lecture 2.